You look concerned already.
I was thinking about your dark on light theme seems pretty readable, and the light on dark theme usually it doesn't seem very readable.
I think dark and light is easier to read on projectors.
Yeah, but it surprises me how clear this is. So I was kind of thinking like if there was something else, because the color scheme is very high contrast with this.
Yeah, I kind of picked this to be legible on. Yeah. All right, now's the moment.
Okay.
So, you may, or in some cases may not, be writing tests for Grace Shopper. We would really love it if you wrote some. Hello. I think whenever I've seen tests, I've swooned a little bit. Those have been particularly nice code reviews for me. And the truth is, we don't have projects that are really long enough to demonstrate the value of testing. I think Capstone is just long enough that you can get to a point, and many teams do get to this point, where they're like, gosh, we really wish we had written some tests a week ago. But then it's over. And so, so you don't really get to see the value of tests, which is not just that they help you move, or that they help you clarify what it is that you want to do, which they do. Here, let's actually write this down. Why tests. Figure out what we want to do. But also that as your product gains complexity, you can actually make movement without worrying that you're breaking something. So allow us to keep moving when as the project scales. So this is definitely true of the back end. Like, having your API routes tested is pretty clearly a win. In terms of the first one of these. And then it somewhat matters in terms of the second point, that is, like, as our project gains complexity, having tests for our backend is helpful. But actually, your backend does not change nearly so much as your front end does, usually, at least in projects here. Usually, you write some API routes, and then you mostly use those routes from an increasingly complex front end. And so from that point of view, having front end tests can actually be much more helpful in terms of ensuring the stability of your project as it grows. On a project that is actually deployed to production, like an ongoing project that you work on later for pay, that balance won't be quite as skewed towards the front end, because there will usually be a more developed back end. There's a healthier, prod is of a larger, if not healthier size at most companies. But it still is often true. And it's also the case that front end stuff in general is not as frequently tested. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One of it, which is it is because it changes a lot. So code that changes a lot means that the tests will have to change a lot as well. So if you have front-end tests that are really, really particular about how your site looks, then every time you change 5 pixels on some button, you break some tests. That's of questionable value, right? If all you're doing is making a change and then recapitulating the change in the test, you've really just kind of doubled your own work. And maybe you've caught some bugs that you didn't expect, or some places where a change is changing more than you meant it to, and that's useful. But testing that's too granular, especially testing of presentation and style that is too granular can actually be a drag on your performance. So there's really this question of temperance, like testing things that are valuable and or fragile, and leaving the rest unspecified. That is mutable. So from that perspective, I'm going to change our ordering slightly, because I think the highest value things you can test are your redux reducers. And by that I mean not so much the fact that when you get products, the returned state is a bunch of products. That is something that is relatively easy to test, and we'll see how to test it, and so it's worth testing. But really, as your reducers become more complex, as sometimes they will, particularly if you write games. In fact, if you write a game, if you decide to do a board game or some other kind of game for your capstone, you will thank yourselves if you decide to write tests for it. Even though it'll make things slower to begin with, you will more than win back those dividends when you are trying desperately to debug some weird rules issue that cropped up and you don't know when. Or rather, when you are not doing that because you know, because your tests broke when you introduced the problem. Also, when you have complex behavior is when test-driven development can really help you clarify your thought process. So if you're having trouble considering how to write a reducer, you might first write the test for it, and then that gives you basically a bunch of examples of what it should be doing, and then you can write the thing. That's the ideal of test-driven development. Any questions so far? Okay, let's do it. Let's test a reducer. And I'm going to test a not very exciting reducer for, oh, we should change this. But this is our dream store, Onerica. It has not seen a great deal of development since last time, so I'm sorry about the front end. And let's say that, okay, so as you'll recall, I started work in our first lecture on this dreams component. I think we can all agree that this is not everything that's needed to display a dream, so what we're going to do is eventually we're going to improve this interface a bit. We're going to do it in a test-driven way, so I'm going to write the tests for these components, and then we'll see how, and then we'll watch them fail, and then we'll like fix up these components to make them work again. And then first, we're going to actually add the reducers to keep this data in the store. So let's see how that goes. We've got, oh, we already have, look at this, in the boilerplate, we already have an example of how to, oh, this is doing a lot. So this, if you look at the spec for the user's reducer, sort of the user's actions, it's using the Axios mock adapter to actually fake the responses from backend requests that are being made from thunks in the user module here. And then we're guaranteeing that the actions that were sent to the store are what we expect them to be. These are pretty complex tests. I'm actually not going to cover mocking out backend requests. I don't think it's like valueless, but I think it's harder than the sort of lower hanging fruit of testing your reducers, which is something that I want you all to have familiarity with and to like feel empowered to do. Because mocking reducers is, because testing reducers is like high value and fun. Insofar as tests can be fun, it's like the easiest kind of test to write because reducers are, by definition, pure functions. So let's go ahead and I'm going to create I guess first I need to figure out what it is that I'm doing. And I think what I'm doing is I'm creating redux actions to populate the dreams part of my database, or of my store. So I'm going to touch client store dreams.js and client store dreams.spec.js. In this boilerplate, as you may have noticed, the convention is that test files live alongside the things they're testing as .spec.js, which I quite like. It means that you never have any question about where a given spec should be. The answer is right next to the thing that you are trying to test. So I'm going to grab a little bit of like boilerplate from this user spec. And the boilerplate I'm grabbing is just importing, or is just this line, which tells ESLint to be quiet about describe before each, after, and it. Otherwise, ESLint would complain and say, you never defined describe. Because I didn't, we didn't, Mocha did. And I'm also going to grab expect, which will, of course, give us the ability to make expectations in this kind of behavioral-driven, like, expect this dot type to be equal, so on. So in our dream spec, I'm going to paste that in, and I'm going to describe the dream reducer. Okay, so let's assume that my dreams, let's call it a dreams reducer. That sounds like a William Gibson device of some kind. So what should my dreams reducer be able to do? You just wrote like 4 of these. Yeah. So it can get dreams. There's various opinions on what you should call this. My favorite, I think, is stock dreams, as in put them into the store. But we'll say get, because I think it's clear. So it responds to get dreams with the dreams. You can get fancier with and more precise with these descriptions, but you don't really have to. Okay, so let's start there. And we'll have to import some things. So let's import default as reducer from dreams. And we'll also import get dreams. So the first thing we're going to notice when we go and look at our test over here is that this file is not running at all. Why is that, do you suppose? Client, server, should be running. Oh, no, this is working. Sorry, get dreams is just going to be undefined, which will be sort of a difficult thing to debug, but let's go fix that right now.
That's my least favorite thing about
import export. Yeah, it's like a little dangerous, isn't it?
Yeah.
Does it happen even if you put this into strict mode?
Yes.
Okay.
Webpack automatically puts all modules into strict
Oh,
mode.
thanks, Webpack. Okay, yeah, so let's just know that that is a hand grenade that we could decide to hang on to, and instead not. So get dreams is get dreams. And okay, so we want to test a reducer. A reducer is just a function that takes a state and returns a new state, so we can just call it. And in particular, we can call reducer, you know, I think I've decided we'll call it reducer. We can call the reducer with a state, which we can pass in undefined to say we're not giving you a current state, and an action, get dreams, with these dreams, 1, 2, 3. And I can then say expect. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes, that is in fact that is exactly why we want to pass an undefined like that. If you pass in null, then it'll get null. Yeah, then it won't trigger the default value. So I think we can say expect dreams to deep equal 1, 2, 3.
Why do you have to say deep equal?
So maybe I don't, but I have this sense that if I do equal, it'll compare them with double equal, which actually I think will work in this case because I'm comparing 3 numbers with 3 numbers. Oh. But what I actually want is to compare each thing in the list rather than comparing the list as strings. So we can look at different ways this can fail. Let's first see what error we got from this. So this problem, what's going on here? This is like not the most obvious error message. Oh yeah. I can also increase the font size. So it's saying type error 0, _ dreams2.default is not a function. Oh yeah, sorry. It says I'll paste it into my more legible window here. So it gave this error. Type error 0 dreams2.default is not a function. I'm dwelling on this because you're going to get this error someday, and I want you to remember it. Yeah. Yeah, I think I didn't do anything in here. Yeah, I, in fact, have not exported a default. So this is exactly what Gabe was saying he doesn't like. This should probably throw an error, like there is no default export. JavaScript has everything it needs to tell me that, but instead it's deciding to tell me this, which is not helpful, man. But I can fix it pretty easily. Default reducer, state action,
one of the promised benefits of the import-export ES2015 module syntax is that it enables a lot more of what we call static analysis, meaning that your editors can analyze the use of your imports and exports without actually running any code. Well, one of the best possible things that it could check would be, are you exporting a default?
Right.
But it just doesn't bother.
Which actually, there should be a Webpack plugin to do this, or a Webpack something to do it. Like uber strict mode. Okay, so now having exported a function, I get a more reasonable failure, which is I expected undefined to equal this array of dreams. Every number is a dream. That's true. And so to fix that, I can make my reducer kind of do the obvious thing, or do anything, and switch on the action type and say when I am trying to get dreams, I'm going to return action.dreams. And only otherwise will I return the state I was given. So now Okay, so this is interesting. Right. So if I say expect dreams to equal 1, 2, 3, which is probably the most obvious way to write this sentence, it fails, which is actually slightly surprising to me, but what do you think is happening? Yeah, sorry, the failure we're getting is we expected, expected an array containing 1, 2, 3 to equal an array containing 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so I think this is doing comparison with triple equals. To equal, it's not going to give me more guidance than that. Yeah, so that's my hypothesis, that this is doing a triple equal comparison. They're not triple equal to each other. So instead, I have to do something else. I think if I say to deep equal, it will go and compare each item and then also compare the lengths. And yes, indeed, that works. So that is the answer to Gabe's earlier question of why I am doing a deep comparison. There are other try matchers for dealing with lists. So I could say, like, expect dreams to contain something. 2. If I say expect it to contain 7, it won't. And then you can go look at the chai docs to see all of the different matchers for lists. There's a bunch of them. For the most part, I find myself checking if things are deep equal. I'm noticing now also that there's one thing we didn't really check on the reducer, which is we didn't check to see that it starts off with something. Like, our reducer specifies an initial value for its part of state. And we usually do that here, where we specify an initial, a default value for state. How do I check that in my test? It's actually kind of important. Yeah. So I can attach this reducer to a store and then call getState and do all that. But it seems like there must be an easier way. Like this, redux can't be doing anything to this reducer that I can't do. So what is it doing? Yeah. Right. And what's a good choice, maybe? Undefined. Is there an action type that really captures initialization? That's sort of a leading question.
Does anybody remember what's the first thing you see if you open the Redux Dev Tools in the list of actions? You may have mentally blocked it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, good job.
Yeah, so there is a special action that Redux dispatches first. And so we're going to pass in undefined as the start state, and then this will be, it's at init, as I recall. So this is going to fail because I don't actually have a default set, and now I do. Great. Incidentally, I'm working in this mode where Mocha is running every time I save. That's not provided to you. There's no like npm run test watch. But you can do it yourself by saying npm run test --, which says send all of the next command line flags to Mocha, and then -w, which says watch the tree. Okay, what's next? So we've got get dreams. Do you want anything else? Let's do one more just to see a mutation of data. So let's say it wants to add dream by appending the dream. So here, we're going to start with a set of dreams, and then, oops, and then pass that state in. And then the action will be add a dream, and the dream will be 11. And then afterwards, we can expect dreams to deep equal 1, 2, 3, 11. This will fail on so many levels. We can add the add dream action. Which will still fail because I didn't support it here. And then when I do support it, I get green. Yeah. Oh.
So if you're exporting the variables simply to the is that something it seems like that's something you might not want to do?
I think it's okay. Also, you kind of want them exported anyway, or it's not bad to have them exported. It's relatively common to have these. It's actually relatively common to have them in a common file of constants for the whole app. But it's also fine to have them here and just to export them from here. If we had action creators, we maybe wouldn't need to access them externally very often, and that's okay. But it's also not bad. I mean, they're not secrets or anything. They are, I've referred to them as the dumbest variables you will ever declare. And that's fine. But putting them in, exporting them and sort of making them the canonical way of talking about these types of actions gives you the ability to, for example, change them later if you need to. Like maybe I want to namespace this and be like, this is for our get dreams, but someone else's get dreams doesn't have the same action type. Yeah.
How would I test that I didn't mutate the old state?
Oh, good question. So one way to do that would be to just check that initial dreams is still what you set it to here. And this is a simple enough test that that's probably something I would do. To equal 1, 2, 3. Another way of checking this is to say expect dreams not to equal initial dreams. And you might be about to ask, what's the difference between EQL and EQUAL? And the answer is actually that I had thought that EQL did triple equals and EQUAL did double equals, and now I'm just not sure. This is the cargo cult that I have signed up for.
Actually,
so
EQL is deep equal.
EQL is deep equal.
Yes.
Okay, okay. So I could be doing
dot equal is shallow equality.
So I could be doing dot EQL.
Yes.
Okay, okay.
And then we want on 28. We actually want to say not to equal for EQAL. 28.
Not to right. Okay.
Because stupid API decisions.
Yeah, this, as you can tell, I don't find these the most easy to understand. We teach this form. You are also welcome to use other forms like assert dreams not equal to initial dreams. And then you need to import assert. But it works fine to do so if you find yourself chafing on Chai's natural language style. Node comes with a built-in assert library that Webpack makes available to us. And so you can do assertions just like this. We changed this test, so let's make sure to break it and make sure that it's working. So I will change addDream to do state.push action.dream and then return state. And now, actually, several things are failing. So this check is failing. And if I get rid of this check, then this check is now failing, not to equal. Or sorry, this check is failing. And if I comment that out, this assertion should fail. Yeah, great.
Does equal take a second parameter that's a message?
It does. It does. That is a very good point.
I asked if the equal function takes a second parameter, which is a custom message.
So yeah, so if you give it, basically at the last part of your Chai expectation chain, if you give it a string, it'll use that as a message for when it fails. So in this case, it lets you tag what you're expecting. So appends the dream, does not modify the state. Assert also does the same thing. So let's say does not modify the state. These two styles of specifying how a test should work are called the assertion style and the behavior-driven development style. And this, I think, is more common. And some people are also partial to this, to using asserts. OK, questions so far? I think that covers, surprisingly, that covers testing reducers. Is there anything that a reducer might do that we haven't talked about? Because really, there's nothing, like reducers don't have side effects. Reducers can't call out to an external API and do something. Its behavior is completely defined by what's passed in and what's returned. So anytime you can construct an example, and those examples will be made out of pure JavaScript objects because that's what reducers take, you can write a test for your reducer. So this is why I think it's like very high value to do and then relatively easy to maintain. Okay, next up. Done, so easy. Okay. Next up, testing components. Components are actually not so much harder to test than reducers because they are not so very different from reducers. They take some props and state, and they return JSX. Basically, they return a React element tree, and that is what components do. And so if we just have a way to sort of mount a component in isolation or to like force it to pretend to render and then see what it would render given some collection of props or given an internal state, then we will have a pretty good idea that we can test the behavior of a component. We'll like be able to see what it does in different conditions. And you could do that yourself. You could instantiate your component instance and poke its props and even call set state on it, right? There's nothing special about set state that prevents you from calling it on an instance from the outside. But instead, there's a library that sort of smooths over the rough edges of doing that, and it's called Enzyme. It was developed at Airbnb. And that's what we've used in the like the senior checkpoint specs, and that's what we're going to recommend that you use for testing your components. There's actually an example of it in the boilerplate, if you have Gabe's boilerplate. And so let's just walk through this. There's a bit of, well, test boilerplate at the top. We bring in, or we appease the linter, we bring in chai. We also bring in React, because we're going to be testing React here. We're going to need JSX to be compiled. We bring in enzyme and the enzyme function shallow, which will let us shallowly render a component. I'll talk about what shallow rendering is in a second. I wouldn't worry too much about this adapter. It allows enzyme to work with React 16 because everything is a moving target and some things require spackle to fit together. And then finally, we bring in the component that we're testing. So this component does not have a whole bunch of complexity to it, which is nice. But we can see that when we render it, so first we have this before each block, which is going to say before each of the it blocks within this test, shallowly render this JSX string. So what that means is it's going to grab this component, feed it these props, and see what it would return from its render method, and make that available as user home with kind of a nice API around it to let you make assertions about what's inside that tree. So the API that Enzyme gives us is kind of jQuery-like. We can say, for example, find an H3, so find a third-level header in the rendered output of user home, and get its text. And then that lets us make assertions about it. So any questions about what's going on here? Cool, yeah.
So I guess I'm kind of slightly, I'm sort of following it, but like you're finding an H3, what page is this looking at? Is it like my index HTML? I'm not following like this H3 list.
Yeah, it does not live on any page. It is as though we have extracted this single component, the user home component, which let's actually bring it up. So here's our component, and this component could live on any page. When we run it in a test, we're kind of extracting it from the context of the application and putting it on the operating table. So this chunk of JSX is going to be given to us through this user home object. It is returned from shallow, and we can access it and ask questions about what's inside of it without worrying about what's on the page or what context it's in, because it is not in any context. It is like sort of sucked out of it. Does that answer your question? Great. So another thing we might do, for example, we might notice that we've added this dream list component, but we have not added a test to ensure that it's there. So if I wanted to, I could do that, and in fact I do kind of want to, because it'll show you how to query for subcomponents, because it's not exactly the same. So let's first see if I'm doing the right thing here. Actually, wait, let's not, because if I'm doing the wrong thing, our test will discover it. So first I need to import this component by saying import, I think it's Dreamlist. I think it's just exported default from Dreamlist. Oh, I think I called it Dreams, actually. And then I can say it renders a list of the user's dreams. And then I can say expect user home dot find dream list. And here I'm literally passing in the component. And to not be null. You don't pass it in as a string, no, because React doesn't know it as a string. React knows it as this function. This actually might be a list that's returned, if I recall. Not be null is not a function. Oh, sorry, my reducer is still failing.
Why can't you not be equal to null?
You can. You can do a lot of things multiple ways in Chai. Okay, so that's passing. I don't have like a really good feeling about that because I kind of think that test was not correct. Let me just try and break it to make sure that it's working. Yeah, so I removed it and it's still there. So let's see what I get. I bet this is returning an array. Which actually we could find out. Userhome.find. This is the wrong documentation. Visual Studio Code is trying to be helpful, but it's really not being helpful here. So I bet this is returning a list of some kind. So I'm going to say to not be empty. And that will still fail. Gabe, do you recall what this is?
I do not. I was going to say,
well,
this console log.
Yep, exactly. I think it might be like a selection or something. Ah, okay. So to not have length 0. Or maybe even to have length 1. There should be one of those, not 8.
It's have dot length.
Oh. But got 0. Okay, great. Go team.
Very important thing that Ashi's demonstrated several times. You should always witness your tests fail. Because you break your code and prove the test works when the code is broken. It flags up the problem. When you put the code back where it's supposed to be in passes.
Yeah, if like I could have very easily not broken this test and not noticed that it wasn't testing anything, right? It's like, oh great, I added a test and it passed. So now it should pass. Great.
I keep waiting for the day when students come to me from a code review, and it's like, oh, you've got 64 passing tests that you added, and they're all expected one to be one.
Right. Let's see, we can do a little bit more. I was going to write out a whole component, but we're getting to the edge of time. So let's just check. You can check some additional things, like the list of, like you can check what props are given to element in the tree by saying, okay, so it attaches the user's dreams to the dream list. And I think I can say user home.find dream list. And then there is a list.props, I believe. Which is a function which prints all of its props, so I can expect things of this. So I can say expect list.props to have property dreams with the value this stuff. This also might fail for the array equivalency issue we got into before. We expected it to have an array with 2 things in it, but it had this other completely identical array, well, no, completely equivalent array, but not identical, with 2 things in it. What's the solution here? There's a few ways around it. I'm going to grab the dreams like this, and then just say expect dreams to equal that. And again, let's watch it fail, and we'll watch it pass. So obviously in a real emergency, or in your actual tests, you will probably have more complex data that you're passing in. For example, this user, rather than just being a string, would probably be an object with dreams in it. So this isn't quite so synthetic, where I'm testing for the same hard-coded data that I hard-coded in the component. But this is the general idea. When you have components that are stateless, as this one is, you only have to check that for a given set of props, it renders what you expect. If you have stateful components, and you want to see how they evolve as you change their state, Enzyme has some approaches to that. You can call setState on this fake mounted component, and then see what it's displaying afterwards. I'm not going to go into that right now. I think it's probably a little bit on the, let's say, bougie side of the cost to benefit ratio, especially for Grace Shopper. But know that that functionality is there if you need it. And finally, we have not talked about how to test map state to props or map dispatch to props. One answer is to punt on it and be like, oh, it's probably fine. They're so short. Another answer is to export them and test them as pure functions, which they are. And finally, a third answer, which I will send out an example of, is to actually take the connected component and mount it under a store, like go and create a provider in the test and put it under there, and then see what happens as you change the state of the store. So that's starting to get towards being an integration test where we actually just create whole chunks of our app and poke them to make sure that they're doing the right thing. But as we start to have more complexity in our app, those kinds of tests start to be quite useful. Okay, any questions? All right, cool. Oh, yeah.
What do you and Gabriel expect us to have tested for the end of Grace Shopper?
So I would love to see some of each kind of test. So in particular, I think the highest value tests are tests of your backend models and tests of your reducers, particularly any functionality that is complex in some way. So you might have some logic in your cart reducer. You might have trying to think of other cases where you have logic. But anytime you're doing something more than our example reducer was doing here, it's a really good candidate for testing. You don't have to test every single route that returns like a find all of its models, or every single reducer that tests, or every single reducer that sort of manages a RESTful resource in basically the same way. Obviously, those tests are relatively easy to write, so if you have time or if you feel like doing something meditative, you can write those tests once and then sort of copy paste and change them. But what we'd like to see more than a completely exhaustive set of tests is exploration of the different types of tests and tests of particularly complex parts of your app. Does that answer your question and also agree with your expectations?
Feeling very split right now.
That's fun. All right.
Aaron?
Yeah.
So this may not be so relevant to Great Shopper specifically, but in general, how would we test on the interactivity of the component? For example, maybe I want to have to drag my mouse, or I want to have complex action based on clicking and this and that and that.
So that is a really good question. I'm going to demonstrate it here because it's a really good point and there's a pretty simple answer to it. The answer is you can call .click and just click things and that'll simulate an event. So let's say that I have a link here. We'll say that it's log out. So a on click, yeah, props.logout. So what I can do is say let was did log out equals false. Yeah, fail. On click will be this function that sets did log out to be true. There are more sophisticated libraries that you can use to do this, but for the sake of time, this is what we're going to do. And then in a test, I can say it logs out when you click the link. And if I go and find an anchor tag and click it, and then I should be able to say that that did log out will now be true. And just to show that it's different, we'll expect it to be false and then true. Click is not a function. What's that?
It doesn't have implicit looping, right? You get a file.
Oh, it's 0. Is that right? Oh, sorry, dot first. First is a thing, though? So shallow wrapper.
Yeah. So first is a thing.
First of 0 is undefined. Maybe I have to call that get 0. Yeah, that was right.
Of course.
Why is first not a synonym for get 0? Nobody knows. What could that possibly mean? That's also not a function. Okay, I'm...
The on click? No. I don't know.
Yeah, I can get you the answer in like 1 minute with the docs, but the answer is something like this. There's a click method somewhere on this virtual DOM tree. I'll find it here. Any other questions? Okay.
That simulated like.
That's.
Yeah.
I feel like at one point it was clicked, you know?
Possibly. But, sorry, that simulate takes an effect. So
Oh, like this?
yeah, which makes sense because now you can simulate any effect.
That's nice. Great.
For some reason it's not.
I think maybe I kept it broken. Find a get. Oh, this, sorry, it should be log out. Okay. This is the recipe. Find the thing and then simulate a click on it. Here we go.
Another magic spell.
Yeah. All right. Great work with your grid shoppers. They're all looking really good. I have one group that needs a code review from me tomorrow morning. Sorry about that. Apart from that, have a great night.
As you can see, I'm already buying into the whole